The housing market is propped up on these bad loans.
This has been enormously profitable.
We were making too much money.
Previously, I made a video about how The Big Short, Margin Call, and Too Big to Fail make an unofficial trilogy of finance movies. A brief recap. Each film shows a different perspective on the 2008 financial crisis. The Big Short shows the investor perspective, Margin Call shows the bank perspective, and Too Big to Fail shows the government perspective. The films also give a timeline of the crisis. The Big Short takes place from March 2005 to March 2008. Margin Call could be placed in the spring of 2007. Too Big to Fail covers May 2008 to October 2008. In our first look at this unofficial trilogy, we discussed how the films have to balance simplifying the crisis so the audience can understand it, while still showing its complexity. And now, in part 2, we will look at how the films address the role of the U.S. government and the idea of who is accountable for the crisis. Before we begin, 2 things. 1. There is a perspective missing from this trilogy. The perspective of regular people and how the crisis impacted them. If you'd like to see a video about what movie could add that perspective, drop a comment down below and subscribe. 2. These 3 films take artistic license and have fictional elements to them. This discussion is not a look at fact versus fiction. Rather, it's a look at how these films navigate these topics for the audience. Let's get started.
They can slow you down. They can't stop you.
While each film in the unofficial trilogy includes information on the banks and how they operated during the crash, they also all include information on the government. The level of governmental involvement in the plot of each film depends on what perspective it is showing. As an explainer film, The Big Short has to include the government. However, since The Big Short is through an investor perspective, it cannot focus completely on the government. So, references to the government's actions or inactions are sprinkled throughout lines in the film, with the persistent idea that the government is not regulating the banks sufficiently. There are 2 scenes where the film goes in depth on the government's role. During the American Securitization Forum, Jamie visits Evie, who works at the SEC. Evie tells Jamie that the SEC doesn't investigate mortgage bonds, and since their budget was cut, they don't investigate much. She's there to network for a job at one of the banks. Jamie, incredulous, says there has to be a law against working for a financial institution after working in financial regulation. She says no. At the end, Vinny tells Mark they need to sell. Mark says there will be a bailout, and the banks knew. They weren't being stupid, they just didn't care. Jared, as narrator, gives an alternate path for how the government could have handled the crisis, with executives going to jail, Congress breaking up the banks, and Congress regulating the industry. Then he says that's not what happened. The banks lobbied against reform. Margin Call has the least amount of references to the government. In fact, as far as I know, there's only one direct mention of it. In the senior partners meeting, John asks Sam how he would do a fire sale. At the end of Sam's explanation, he says that all of their trades have to be gone by lunchtime, partly because the feds would be there trying to slow them down in the afternoon. I find it interesting that the government is only mentioned at the end of the explanation, as though it's not the biggest concern. Ramesh says to John that feds can slow you down, they can't stop you. It's yours to sell. In Margin Call, the firm is operating at such a level that the government is like an ant, small in comparison and barely on the firm's radar. The firm's in-house counsel is present in some scenes, but he doesn't say anything. There are 2 other implied references to the government. When Sam tells Will to email Peter's findings, Will says, "I don't think that would be a good idea." This line is layered with a few meanings, one of them being that Will doesn't want a paper trail, perhaps in case of a government investigation. After the senior partners meeting, John tells Sam that this isn't the last situation he'll have to deal with this week. This could mean dealing with the fallout from the fire sale, issues with other firms, and/or government inquiries. Why aren't there more references to the government in Margin Call? As it's completely fictional, it can stay completely focused on the banking perspective. It doesn't have to include historical moments. In contrast, the other two films do have to include the government because they are following real events. Too Big to Fail is all about how the government approached the crisis. As this film includes a lot of complex government actions, let's look at some of the key elements. The first half of the film is dedicated to Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson and his team's efforts to stop a Lehman bankruptcy. The second half of the film handles the fallout from Lehman declaring bankruptcy. In this film, the role of the government agencies is to facilitate negotiations between the banks. Later, they also work with Congress on a legislative solution. As the film progresses, the crisis becomes more and more complicated. And subsequently, the amount of stakeholders and the amount of people who are required to solve the problem or approve the solutions increases. There is constant tension between what the different agencies can do and what they have to ask for, whether it's from the banks or Congress. For example, during the film's first scene, when trying to shore up Lehman Brothers, Hank says, "With the full weight of the United States Treasury behind me, all I can do is call Warren Buffett." Later, all efforts to save Lehman have fallen through. It's apparent that Lehman has to declare bankruptcy. The head of the SEC says he will call Lehman and then doesn't. When he's pushed to call them, he says to Hank, "I can't tell a private company to file for bankruptcy. I don't have that kind of power." As the call continues, it's stilted, and the phrasing is awkward as he avoids outright telling them to file. After Lehman declares bankruptcy, the problems continue to escalate. The chairman of the Federal Reserve tells Hank that they need a solution that is not unilaterally from the Fed, and that they have been putting off going to Congress. Now, it would seem obvious that the government's role in Too Big to Fail should be as regulator. And that brings us to our next section.
They weren't being stupid. They just didn't care.
Across our look at the unofficial trilogy, we've seen how the films create a timeline of the crisis, balance simplicity and complexity, and include the role of government. The plots detail how the crisis happened. The ultimate question the audience might have after watching these films is this: who is responsible for the 2008 financial crisis? I want to stress again that this is not a fact versus fiction comparison. This is how each film conveys accountability. The Big Short and Too Big to Fail were both based on nonfiction books if you want to learn more about the history of the crisis. Let's look at how each of the films answers the question of who is responsible. At the beginning of The Big Short, Michael reads through top-selling mortgage bonds and finds that they are filled with risky subprime loans. Michael says he doesn't think they know what they've made. Mark says the banks were stupid. Contrast these scenes with the ending, where Mark says there will be a bailout and the banks knew. They weren't being stupid, they just didn't care. The Big Short leads the audience from the first notion, "I don't think they know what they've made," to its conclusion, "They just didn't care," across the entire film. For example, the mortgage lenders tell Mark that the bonuses on subprime adjustable rate loans skyrocketed with almost non-existent standards. The big banks buy up the loans quickly. When Mark and Vinny visit Standard & Poor's, Georgia tells them that the banks will just go to their competitors if they don't give the banks the ratings they want. Vinny says they are selling ratings for fees. Later, Jamie says that the banks are selling the bad bonds to unsuspecting customers, and the banks won't devalue them until they're off the books. So, who was responsible for the crash? In The Big Short, it's the banks, with the government passively letting it happen. Sadly, despite all of the evidence, Jared says that immigrants and poor people, and even teachers, got the blame. Margin Call takes a similar route as The Big Short by making it seem that the firm was unaware of what was happening, then revealing that the firm knew something was wrong long before it became apparent. And, despite this, they kept going for the financial gains. After Peter discovers that the firm's projected losses are greater than the value of the company, the firm's leadership decides in an emergency meeting to do a fire sale of the toxic MBS products. This will ensure the firm's survival, but it will kill the market, and the other firms that buy the products might not survive. Margin Call shows that the crisis was brewing, and fictionally, the firm accelerated the crash by doing a fire sale. However, who was responsible for how they got there? On the surface, it can seem that this problem is something that's happening to the firm, instead of something that they caused and knew about, especially during the first half of the film. However, there are subtle and overt statements outlining that upper management knew there was a problem a year ago. On a first viewing, it can be easy to miss some of these lines, especially the early ones. They kept going, as Peter says, because it was enormously profitable. I have 2 videos that go in depth on what the firm knew, so I'll link those in the description. Will has a speech about how normal people like the benefits of the system. However, this is from his perspective as a banker as he tries to justify their work. Margin Call shows that the crash was largely the banking industry's fault, and it explains why the banks may have acted the way they did. While The Big Short and Too Big to Fail discuss greed, Margin Call has strong themes around survival. In the banking environment, the decisions made by the firm make sense. The crash was already in motion. Any other firm with the same information would do the same thing. So, for the fictional firm, it's either act on the information first to survive or cease to exist. Margin Call leaves it to the audience to decide if this is justified. J.C. Chandor, the writer and director of Margin Call, said that if he had changed the ending so that Peter had called the SEC and there were consequences for the bank's actions, he would have had financing to make the film earlier. However, the ending of Margin Call closely mirrors the ending of The Big Short, where virtually no bankers go to jail. Too Big to Fail's title sequence includes real news clips of presidents discussing deregulating the banking industry. Then it transitions to news anchors and members of Congress talking about the housing market. It ends with a news clip saying that Hank Paulson may now have to undo some of the deregulation he and his peers pushed through, and lines about what is happening with Lehman Brothers. So it seems that the movie is setting up how the government is accountable for some or all of the crisis, and yet the movie never quite gets there. There are lines that convey accountability, such as Hank saying, "We are not bailing out Lehman. Wall Street has a gambling problem. If government keeps covering their losses, they never learn anything." And Nancy Pelosi saying, "How is it possible you didn't see this coming?" And Hank replying, "If you want to rewind the tape, we can do that. But right now, the one thing we don't have is time." And others. So, Too Big to Fail is telling us these things, but it's not necessarily showing us. The lines feel buried underneath the granular focus on the many events and actions surrounding Lehman's failure. It doesn't seem interested in interrogating the ethics of what the banks were doing leading up to the crash, when compared with The Big Short and Margin Call. Rather, Too Big to Fail shows the varied paths that the government and the banks tried to take to stop or slow the crash, and why each path didn't work. These paths create what-if scenarios for the audience. For example, what if Bank of America had bought Lehman instead of pivoting to Merrill? What if the U.S. government had gone through with the plan to buy toxic assets? Along with this, each character has their own interests and perspectives. There are so many stakeholders. Because of the paths having dead ends, and the stakeholders not being a monolith, accountability for the crash feels diffused. For me, Hank presents a microcosm of how this movie approaches accountability for the crisis. Hank was the CEO of Goldman Sachs in the mid-2000s before becoming Treasury Secretary. The film references a few times how much money he made while at Goldman. It's implied that Hank made this money under the financial system that is now crashing. Yet, we almost never see Hank have any moments of introspection about this or how decisions he made while at Goldman contributed to the crisis. He's instead presented as being principled, patriotic, stubborn, and down to earth. There is a scene where the characters explain how the crisis happened, going all the way back to the creation of mortgage-backed securities. Michelle says, "And what do I say when they ask me why it wasn't regulated?" Hank answers, "No one wanted to. We were making too much money." This falls flat as an indictment, as it feels like Hank is talking about the system overall and not his part in it specifically. Too Big to Fail balances an impressive amount of plot lines and characters. While I do wish that the concept of accountability was stronger in the film, I can understand how it didn't make it into the final film. That wraps up our second look at the unofficial trilogy of The Big Short, Margin Call, and Too Big to Fail. What do you think? Drop a comment down below. Thanks to everyone who commented on part 1 saying you wanted a part 2. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for your patience. If you liked this video, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.